Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are. Today's video is going to be Cinema's Sketch and Toon system, the tool set for making basically NPR renders, non-photo realistic renderings. Let's go, shall we? Now again, this is not going to be absolutely everything. This is going to be most of the important things that you tend to need. I might do a more advanced video on Sketch another day. Anyway, let's jump in, shall we? Down here in your material area, if you click on Create, and I'm just going to move this up, otherwise we're going to lose our window here. So let's go to Create and down to Shader, and then have a look in amongst all this frankly trash. You will find this one little golden nugget called Sketch Material. Add one of these. Okay, and let's put this back. Okay, here's your Sketch Material. Open this up and you'll get, naturally, your material settings. Now, there's a lot of stuff in here. There's a lot of options, a lot of checkboxes, a lot of gadgets. I'll save you a bit of time up front. We don't need most of this to do most things in Sketch. These do have uses, and as I say, I may do a more advanced video at some point. But to be brutally honest, most of the stuff you're not going to need. Now, I'm a big fan of just making materials up from scratch as you need. But I will say, with the Sketch system, just go to your main page and load a preset. I don't want to try and shortchange you, but most base styles that you're probably going to be after are pretty much in this list. Now, the thumbnails, they're not that useful. Unfortunately, they all just look kind of similar. You don't really see much in there. And doubly unfortunately, the names of these are all largely cut off. So we have all these tech presets where you can't really see much of a difference between them. You just have to hover your mouse over it, look at the full name, and make your judgment based on that. Anyway, so there's a bunch of presets. But let's have a look at the things that we will change in this material. Do keep in mind, Sketch is only partially a material system. A lot of the settings we're actually going to be looking at are a series of tags, render settings, and other materials. So going down this list, we're going to skip over strokes and adjustment just because they're a bit advanced for now. Same thing with distort, to be honest. Let's just go with color. So in your color settings, again, it's a little bit too straightforward really. Pick a color for your line. If I just throw an object in here or two, let's go for a cube and maybe a torus sat over there. First things first, by the way. I know this is a material, but don't drag it onto your objects. You can, but that will break everything I'm going to try and tell you. When we added our Sketch material, it created not just this material, which is being used, but if you have a look in your render settings, we do also actually have a Sketch and Toon section in our render settings now. And just to sort of jump ahead and cut a long story short, this material is already applied to everything. The general idea with Sketch is that once you add a Sketch style, you very, very likely just want that style applied to absolutely everything in your scene, and that's what it does. So when we hit render, here's our sketch. So this line style is already being applied to absolutely everything, so we can adjust the style. Now, as I say, the color is, it's blindingly obvious. Just pick a color, hit render, and lo and behold, that's what you get. Again, there are a few settings down here, another video perhaps. Jumping down, we have thickness. This is going to be how thick you would like your line style to be, measured in pixels. So default is 2, which literally means it's going to be 2 pixels thick, give or take a bit of anti-aliasing. Naturally, choose a value which suits your rendering. And then underneath we have opacity. How strong, how see-through, how transparent should these lines be? If I reduce it down to anything other than 100%, you'll notice that the lines are now a little bit see-through and we can see what's underneath. This is particularly good for any styles where it's like marker pens, watercolors, something where you would traditionally start to see something below the surface once you've drawn the line. And for the time being, that's all I'm actually going to show you down this list. Pick a colour, choose a thickness, and tweak the opacity. But do just simply start off with one of these presets, because they do more or less have every style you're probably after. Now, that seems like it would be quite a short lesson if this is all I need to tell you. Well, no. Let's close this down. Let me just turn my opacity back up for a moment and turn the thickness back down so it's not quite so thick. Okay, so the place where you actually change most settings for your sketch system is in your render settings. So if we open these up, go and have a look at the sketch and Toon section, and in here what you'll find, so there's nothing much on the main page, so we'll skip over that, but on lines, what we essentially have in here is a series of checkboxes. This is asking us, where should the lines appear? Under what circumstances should these lines be drawn? So by default, we have folds, creases, and borders. In other words, you're going to get lines around the outside border of an object, and whenever Cinema detects a fold or a crease, which really is just sort of a peak or a trough. So if there's enough of a crease on the surface, as you would get, for example, on this cube over here, you will get an extra line because Cinema sees that these are effectively folds within a surface. If I turn off folds, and let's get it the wrong way around, 50-50 chance here. Damn, wrong way around. Creases then, maybe creases. There we go. So depending on whether it considers it to be a fold or a crease, you will lose the lines from those. Now, it's not so much that you'd really want to turn these off. You do almost always want these three. It's more that you're going to want to turn on some of the others. For example, let's say I have two cubes and they overlap like this. When I render this, it looks okay, but you would maybe consider that there are some missing lines. But from here to here, for example, I'm thinking, you know what, there should be a line there where these two things overlap. So usually one of the first things you'll want to turn on when using the sketch system is some form of intersections. Intersections are basically overlapping surfaces. Just one tiny bit of advice, by the way. If you don't see all of these settings, if you're looking at this thinking, I don't have as many choices as he does. First of all, you're probably using an older version of the software, something like version 15 or 16, maybe older. If you would like all of these settings, jump back to your main page and you'll notice there's an extra setting in here called, what's it called now? Control level? Something along those lines. It'll give you three choices of beginner, intermediate, and advanced. Just bump it up to advanced and you'll get all the settings. Anyway, so if I want to get these missing lines here, these would be intersections. So if I turn on intersections, this doesn't unfortunately fix it, because whenever you turn one of these settings on, you'll get another set of settings underneath. So sure, I've enabled the intersections option, but I do have to choose which intersections. And by default, it's only going to draw a line when the object touches itself. What does that really mean? Imagine you had a character. That character might be one single mesh. And if, for example, the fingertips on his hand touched themselves, that would be a self-intersecting object where the mesh touches itself. We don't have that. We have two completely separate objects. So the one which sort of just uniformly generally works for most projects is in here. Set it to be project wide. And again, if you do have an older version of Cinema, your project wide setting might be called scene wide setting. Either way, choose this setting, and Cinema will now check the entire project for any intersections. Move this over here, and when I hit render, there we go. We now have this sort of missing overlapping intersection line. So that's quite a useful one to turn on a lot of the time. Others you may want to consider would be something like edges. If I lose these cubes and I throw in a torus, okay, normally when I hit render we just get the outlines and that's it. But if I go for edges, this is effectively a full wireframe render of the shape. So if you are trying to get some sort of 3D grid computer graphics sort of look to your renderings, turning on edge mode can get you quite a long way. Let's see what else. Another one would be, for example, particle and spline mode. These would allow you to draw a spline, and normally splines don't render, but if you're using Sketch and you enable the spline mode, well, now they do. But of course, watch out for this. Lots of things in cinema will be splines. You'll have spline objects in your extrudes, in your lofts, all sorts of places, maybe some animation paths. They would all suddenly start to render, which could naturally be a bit of a problem. So let me just show you how you get around that little issue. Now remember, back at the start I told you, don't apply this material to any objects. Well, this is one of those cases where maybe you do want to apply the material to an object. If my render settings don't have the spline option turned on, because this is a bit of a damaging bad thing to turn on for your full render, because every spline gets drawn. The question is, how do you render the spline? Well, you apply that sketch material to the spline object. And if you look just to the right, when I drop this on here, we now have this brown sketch style tag. And to be honest, all of these settings you see down here are a complete duplication of your render settings. So this is sort of a project-wide sketch style setting, and if you apply it to an object, well, you then have the exact same things per object one by one. And you will notice, because I dropped this thing onto a spline object, Cinema has intelligently decided, hey, I should probably render splines. And there we go, we can now actually see them. This also allows you to override a style. So perhaps you have a scene where everything is going to be drawn with one style, maybe a sort of a Western 1960s comic book pop art style. And in walks a Japanese character, and perhaps you want that Japanese character to have some sort of Japanese calligraphy brush. I have one in here somewhere. I really wish we could just see the names more easily. There we go. So maybe we could use this calligraphy pen to show the Japanese character. Or maybe we could go for a sort of a technical line diagram for showing some robotic character walking in. So you can have more than one style applied to different objects within the same scene, which is nice. Okay, let's go back into our render settings though. So that more or less covers the most useful settings up here. There are absolutely others which have their uses, but I don't want to have the longest video in the world, so I'm going to skip over those which aren't quite so useful. What I'm going to look at next is this rather unassuming bit in the middle. Default visible and default hidden. Now the first one, it's not so much that we want to change it, but I need to tell you what it is so that we know what the next one does. Default visible sketch matte. This sketch matte bit is this material. If I were to rename this sketch material, let's just call it Viz, because it's visible. Those are one in the same thing. Basically, if you clear this out, this will stop Cinema's sketch system from applying itself to absolutely everything in your scene. So if you do want a normal full photorealistic render with lights and shadows and reflections, but you just want one or two cartoon characters, maybe you're doing a new sequel to Who Framed Roger Rabbit, that would allow you to do this. Just nip over here, in this little teeny tiny pull down box, just choose clear. And you can now just start applying each sketch material to objects one by one. But it's not so much that we want to do this. What I want to show you is this next option, default hidden. This allows you to apply a sketch style to everything that you can't see. And this is a lot more useful than it initially sounds. So let me go back to having maybe just a couple of cubes. Oops, 1, 2. And they're overlapping. Good. And oh, by the way, just in terms of material, you can still apply normal materials to things. So if you don't want these things to be dark grey, just make a normal, regular, standard material and just apply it. You can have both at the same time. This is how you can still colour and texture your cartoon surfaces. Anyway, I have this plain black thick sketch material. I'm going to add a second one. Create, shader, and it's just gone off the edge of the screen, but trust me, I'm just selecting sketch material down here at the bottom like we did the first time. So here's my second sketch material, and I'll just call this sketch number 2. This is for hidden things. What I'm going to do with this is open it up, go to my presets, and scroll down. In amongst these tech presets, these are for doing technical line diagrams. So straight lines, dotted lines, double lines, dot dash, all sorts of sort of construction diagram type things. So if I have a look through here, where have we gone? Tech 0.35 mil dashed line. Okay, that's the one I'm after. So when I add it, you can just about see there. Let me make this a bit larger. Whoop. Oh, that didn't help, thank you. This is a series of little dots and dashes running along the length of this line. What we're going to do is go into our render settings, and where we have this default hidden section, we're going to drag and drop this new dotted line into that section. And watch this. The cool thing is, any part of the model which I can't see because it's hidden, we now get this. This is one of the coolest things about Sketch. It's great for diagrams, building diagrams. If you're trying to make some sort of IKEA construction manual or a Lego construction manual or some technical documentation for something, this is absolutely brilliantly useful. That will do for these lines. So the system I've shown you so far, this really only concerns itself with creating these lines around the objects. It doesn't really have anything to do with how everything gets shaded. That, over here, that is the shading page of your Sketch render settings. Now this whole window is broadly split into two parts. Have a look carefully. Do you see this line running across here? It's a little bit hard to see, but there's this horizontal barrier between these two sections. Everything above this line deals with the background in your project. Everything below the line deals with the actual objects themselves. So first of all, if you're wondering why the background suddenly turned white when we started using the Sketch system, it's because the background is set to use a solid colour, and that colour is, surprise surprise, white. Feel free to throw in a different colour if you would prefer, maybe a nice bit of light blue. There we go. Oh, I think I've just recreated SketchUp. Or rather than using a solid colour, you could throw in some sort of texture. So if you're trying to sort of make this all look like it's pencil sketches rendered onto a piece of rough paper, load in your paper texture into this slot and it will now put that image behind everything. To be brutally honest, this is really no different from you creating a background object, making a material and applying it. So don't expect it's going to be particularly any different in any way. It's just a quick way to change it, because if you're doing Sketch, it's probably something you are doing. If you want, on the other hand, Cinema to just stop dicking around with the background, just turn it off. And that will just leave the background, and it's now back up to you again to choose what happens to your background. And it's very similar for the colouring of objects as well. So let's just take a quick look. So by default, we are quantizing our colours. Now, if you've never really come across this term before, what it means, let's throw in a sphere, make it white, and raise it up. Okay, what this means, let me just make this sphere a bit brighter. Okay, is you're going to get, oops, I seem to have left edge mode turned on, did I? Yes, I did. Okay. What we'll get is this stepped banding. this sort of a gradient that suddenly steps from white through grey, and then eventually down the edges it'll turn to black. Especially if we pop a light source in here and leave a dark area. There we go. Now, okay, fine, I get why it does it. This is sort of known as traditionally a cel-shaded look. Maybe you want it, but maybe you don't. So this quantizing, this is how many different shades it will split it into. And it's not so much that you'd really want to change this too much. It's more that maybe you just don't want this style at all to begin with. So let's have a look at the other choices. And by other choices, I mean the other choice. Quantize is this stepped shading, but the other choice you've got is a gradient. Now, when you hit render in here again, it's just going to look worse. But don't worry. What we've now got underneath is this gradient gadget, which allows us to choose what sort of colours, what sort of shades the whole system should be using. So you can adjust these gradient knots up and down to choose how much of each bit of shading we get. But it's actually more that you might want to change the style of gradient. When you first turn it on, it'll probably look like this. If you hit this teeny tiny little black triangle, you can unfold it and see a few more settings. And once you've done this, you now get access to the interpolation options. If we turn this on, and it doesn't matter too much which of these we choose, they're all very, very, very similar. So just go for something like smooth knot. Or cubic knots. See, there's really not a great deal between them, so don't worry too much about which one you pick. And I'm going to call up Cinema's render region because I want to quickly be able to see what effect this has. So in the middle render button, come down to interactive render region. I can now draw this around, move that out there. Okay, so this is going to give me a good idea about what my final image is actually going to look like. And so long as you put some more interesting knots in here, you can actually get some quite nice effects. So we won't have quite as much white area. Let's turn that down a bit. And I'm going to say, look, I want it to shade down to this grey quite quickly. And I'll put another one here because I want it to maintain that grey for a while. Then I want it to suddenly jump down to a darker shade and then keep that darker shade all the way down just until it ends up as black. So you can start to put these nice smooth transitions from one shade to the next by putting a couple of these knots quite close to each other. And you can just have a nice gradient there by just leaving a nice smooth gradient within the gradient gadget itself. Okay, so that's one of your other choices. Failing that, if neither of these are what you're after, just turn the system off. If you go to the previous setting, so this is saying, look, use this shading mode. If you're not a fan of either of these things, just go to shading mode and say, look, either copy what the background is doing, which will basically just give you purely the lines, quite a useful thing actually, or just turn the whole system off. Stop it, stop messing around with the lighting, just let me take a normal material, put in whatever colours and textures I like. Ooh, let's have this nice old lady wallpaper. And then you can just start throwing on whatever textures and images you prefer. So that's more or less your shading system. Pick something for the background, pick something for the objects, or if the whole thing is just annoying you and you want control back yourself, just turn the object shading system off completely. Okay, now as far as this area of Sketch goes, there's just a couple of last bits and pieces to mention. One of them is the render resolution. There is, in my humble opinion, a bit of an oversight when it comes to Cinema's sketch system. Let me just get a new scene here because Lord knows how many different buttons I've pressed. Right, let's say I've got some of this, some of that, and one of these. And I've created a sketch material. So again, create shader, slightly off the screen, sketch material. And that now applies the sketch material to everything. Fine. But let's say I've decided the thickness of this should be perhaps 5 pixels thick. So let's give it a test render. Okay, good, fine. This will bite you in the arse. Or if you're American, the ass. I've set the thickness of my lines to be 5 pixels. But the problem is, the thickness of my lines will always be 5 pixels. And you might think, what? That's fine. I want them to be 5. What's wrong with that? No, you don't. One thing we do in 3D a lot is test renders. Hundreds, thousands of test renders. We do small resolution test renders. We do huge print resolution renders. We do HD TV renders. Within a project, even though you might know what size you want it to be right at the very start, you will be doing small tests to save yourself time. And the problem is Sketch's thickness option doesn't take this into account. So let's say my project ultimately is going to be 2000 by 1000 pixels. A nice good resolution widescreen image. Okay. And I'm working away, la la la, front view, top view. I do a small test render, hit render in here, see what we get. Okay, there's my image. I would expect that when I do my full resolution render, it would simply be a larger version of this. It won't be. Watch what happens. When I do my final render, ooh, here's some of the tests I was doing earlier. Let's just close those down. When I do my full resolution render, I get this. These lines are noticeably thinner than these lines are. That's because if I zoom this thing up to normal 100% size, the lines are going to be 5 pixels thick here, and the lines are going to be 5 pixels thick here. But relatively, the larger picture makes them look thin, so my small test renders won't look like the final image, which is a problem. You can get around this, you've just got to remember to actually change the setting. In your render settings, so ideally this is actually one of the first things you should do if you're using Sketch, because if you leave it to the very end and you get everything looking perfect, then you do your final output, you're going to get annoyed. Anyway, Sketch and Toon, go to your render page, and there is a setting just literally called Resolution Independent. Seeing as everything else in this entire piece of software is resolution independent, probably would have been a good idea if this were turned on. Anyway, let's fix it. Turn it on. We're going to change this because what we want to do is set a final destination. Let's say the final intended thing for this is going to be a sort of a 1920 by 1080 video. Set the base width to whatever you think your final resolution is going to be, and then that's it. You just leave it. My 5 pixel thick line will be 5 pixels if I render this resolution. If further down the line I decide, maybe me and my client decide, hey, let's do this in 4K. Well, when you do the 4K render, because it's 5 pixels thick at this resolution, when I do the 4K, which is twice as big, it will be 10 pixels thick. So you don't ever have to come in here and change it. Just choose what you think you're going to be working to, and then simply leave the setting forever. Never ever change this once you've sort of set it up. Otherwise, all your lines will suddenly get thicker or thinner. Which, by the way, you could use this as a global way to change the thickness or the thinness if you wanted. Although, to be honest, that's what the setting above it does anyway. Okay, so that's the render settings. There is just one last little thing I think I will show you just before we finish this first part of the video. And that is the quick, simple little animation system. Just to say, by the way, there will be more to this. I might split this into 2 videos, one where we cover the lines, which is this, and another one where we cover the more advanced shading systems of the sketch system. Anyway, the last thing I want to show you just for now, let's open up our material, is just this little animate page at the bottom. This is a quick, simple way that you can draw the lines as an animation within your project. So all you've got to do, let's make this larger, let's throw this up here. Right, so if I enable this option called Draw, sounds like a cowboy western meeting at noon. Draw. Anyway, the default behavior for this is that Cinema will draw each line one by one from the start to the end of the project. So my project is 90 frames long. If I were to render out the entire animation by going to Output, let's get a more sensible size image, maybe 800 by 500, and I tell it to output all of the frames, but I don't really particularly want to save it, so I'll just turn it off for now. Right, when I hit render, it'll complain that I'm not saving, but I don't really care. And away we go. Oops, I've left that resolution independent setting turned on, haven't I? Let's just disable that. Nope. Let's set a thickness for the lines. Ooh, 3 pixels, that will do. Okay, let's try that one again, shall we? So here we go. So at 100% zoom, so we've got the right size. As this renders, you can actually see all of these lines being drawn one by one. If I press play, you can now see as an animation all these lines being drawn piece by piece, and yeah, there they go. Quite a nice animation. But I don't really get any choice over how long this process takes or how fast it goes. You do have 1 or 2 things you can change. In your sketch material, underneath the animate section, basically the draw speed. The default behavior is that Cinema draws this between the start of the animation, or frame 0 here, and it finishes it just wherever the animation ends. So it's going to take the full 90 frames. If you'd like a bit more control, go for completion mode instead. Completion simply gives you a percentage. So you get to choose how complete the drawing is. So you can keyframe this, and I'll say, look, start the animation at frame 10 and make it 0% complete. In other words, there will be no lines. Hit record. And then maybe after 40 frames, I would like the drawing to be absolutely complete and finished. So set the completion up to 100%. Hit record. And there we go. My drawing will now take place between these 2 specified points rather than just arbitrarily however long my project lasts. If I hit render, tell it to continue, we'll get a few frames of absolutely nothing, a few frames of drawing the line system, and then for the rest of the animation, the drawing will be complete. So when I hit play, let me just turn off this ping pong mode, it will play, draws the lines, finishes. So you get to choose how long it takes to do. The completion mode is generally the most straightforward one to work with. The only other little bit is the method. Do you want Cinema to draw each individual little line one after the other? That's our default behavior. Or do you want it to just draw everything simultaneously, as if you've got this sort of multi-armed god drawing every single part of the picture all simultaneously? That would be all strokes simultaneously for the option. Right, okay, so I think for this first part of a sketch video, I think I'll end it there. Keep an eye out for part 2. If you're watching these videos as they come out, it might be a little while before it comes out, but I'll let you know when it is. If you're watching these videos many years after I've made them, well, it's probably already done by now, hopefully. So anyway, this is Mash from 3D Fluff. Until the next time, cheers for now.